Welcome to our conversation on change management. In this session, I'm going to make a case for why paying attention to change is so critical for you as a manager and as a leader within an organization, and then introduce some models on how we can manage change and make it more friendly to the organization. And then we'll have a bit of a conversation around how you as an individual can handle change. What happens in most of our worlds is we tend to get so focused on our individual agency, our individual department, or even our individual teams that we tend to lose sight of the fact that there's a great deal of change taking place outside of our organizations. And as we move up in the organization, it's critical that we pay more attention to some of these external factors. Let me take you through some and let you get a bit of a perspective on what's happening in the areas of different forms of change. In California, we live in very exciting times. We're dealing with environmental challenges that are in front of us on a regular basis. Our society is somewhat unsettled. On the global scene, our economic situation is very challenging. I'm a reformed economist. My first degree was in economics, and the stability that we saw in the 70s and 80s on the economic scene is compared to today, we find it very, very unsettling. What we see in our challenges is economics are now global. So even though we're located in California or another state, we're impacted by what's going on in the economies around the world. On a federal level, we see that there's a lack of clear direction from Washington on what our economic policies are, and we see that we're having challenges even on the state level trying to figure out what priorities our spending should be. All this creates an incredibly unsettling environment for those of us in business trying to project how we're going to focus our resources on the future. Our physical environment is also very challenging. Here in California, we go from droughts to floods. The picture on the right is a picture I took when I was working in Tianjin, China. There they have very serious environmental challenges. They're doing a good job, in my mind, of working through them. But I wanted to give you a snapshot that the environmental challenges are not just local. In fact, they're global. Technology is changing at an incredibly fast rate. Those of us in business need to be able to embrace technology and technological changes, or we're going to be left behind the curve. We have the challenge of integrating our technology, big data, with a human touch of doing business. I've had the privilege of working in healthcare now for about 11 years, and I'm just so impressed with the dedication of people in that sector. And the physicians there are trying to figure out how to integrate artificial intelligence into the care of patients. The IBM Watson project is a very fascinating project where they're collecting research on a global basis on a real-time format that allows a physician to have access to cutting-edge technologies on a global basis as they're looking at treating a patient. Here in California and globally, we see the political and social environment very unsettled. California, there's a movement in the state where they actually want to separate themselves from the United States, from other states and have their own operating economy, which could be very, very exciting. On a global scale, I had the opportunity to do some work in Turkey. And when I was there, I saw the unrest on a social basis where the young people in that society wanted their country to go in one direction. The ruling government was older. They were seeking more stability, and you saw clashes. We're seeing rules and regulations developing like bunny rabbits. We seem to have a propensity in the United States to pass laws, create rules, create regulations to try to solve problems that may be a one-off. But in business, we're trying to figure out how to navigate through that web of rules and regulations. The bottom line, Zolli has done some interesting research and writing around the subject of change, and he said that what we're facing is an environment that is incredibly complex. It has a high degree of interconnectivity, meaning that you don't just operate as a single entity, that you're part of a whole organization, and the organization is part of a connection within a community, within a society, that things are incredibly fast and volatile in the rates of change. So you may have stability for a short period of time, and then things move very, very quickly. And we have uncertain social and organizational scorecards. So if you're a manager, you may start your year where you're measured on one dimension, and the marketplace may shift during the year where all of a sudden your scorecard changes and all that you'd accomplished no longer has value, and you're being measured against a whole different set of metrics. The natural human response to change that is occurring at this level is for people to move into silos. And we see people starting to narrow their focus on a national scene, you see, or even on a state scene, a local scene. The political leaders tend to focus on party rather than looking at big strategic issues. Thinking in organizations becomes very tactical and technical. So we're taking our workforce, and instead of giving them broader perspectives, we're bringing them down to a narrower and narrower focus. Senior executives tend to focus on a single metric for success, one that they can control that may not necessarily be in the long-term strategic interests of the organization. And those of us in higher education over the last 20 years, as change has been occurring at a faster rate, our response has been to be compressing our subject matter and compressing our degrees to where we're offering narrower and narrower and narrower training and education. So the workforce that's developed today tends to be very narrow and very limited in their skill sets at a time where the need for flexibility and increased skills has grown. So how do we go about dealing with this? I'm very optimistic about the future. I've lived my life pretty much on the edge of chaos and sort of get energized by all this change and activity. Zolli captures a way that you as a manager, you as a leader can start to think about your organizations in how do you address this change. He said we have to start by building trust so that the people within the organization trust each other, that we have mechanisms for candid feedback. I'm worried that here in California in particular, we're so concerned about being politically correct and not hurting anybody's feelings or ending up with a harassment charge that we withdraw from engaging in conversations that are necessarily critical. We have to have dynamic organizational designs that are flexible. We have to allow for failure. We have to get over our habits and start to create new ways of doing things. And we have to learn to play nice in the sandbox. And we have to create and manage informal networks. We're going to have a whole module on networking that you'll be able to refer to. Carol Bennett, who I've worked with now for a couple of years, is very, very thoughtful in the area of change and change management. And this is a worthwhile slide for you to pay attention to because she captured a great deal of what's going on. She said that change is going to be constant, that we are going to learn to live in that environment or perish, that change is going to be difficult, that if you're expecting an easy transition into the future, that's not necessarily going to occur, that because of our inability to accept that change is content or is constant and that change is difficult, unfortunately there's a track record of failure that's taking place. and our lack of response has led to significant overruns, budget failures, and projects not getting launched on time. So what is change? Change is anything that's occurring that disrupts our expectations. So it can be as small as like coming into school today, a particular road that I took was blocked, so I had to reroute. That was a disruption, to a reduction of your budget by 20% over the next 6 months. So change can occur at a very small level, or it can be very, very significant. Kurt Lewin down at USC back in the 70s had an interesting view of change, and he said that as managers and leaders, we need to take a look at the current state in which we're operating, and then start to appreciate that we need to make a transition into a future state. I would argue that most American businesses tend to focus on responding to the market or responding to a competitor rather than really thinking about where they need to be, where they're meeting customer needs that maybe even the customer hasn't perceived that they want to experience their product or their service in that way. And then we need to move our workforce and our organization into a transitional state. Now we're starting to unlearn bad habits. We're starting to think about different ways to do things. And people are hyper uncomfortable. A space that I want to encourage you to operate in is for you to learn as a manager and leader to be comfortable being uncomfortable. If you can develop that particular skill set, you're going to be unique. And then once we've transitioned our organization into the space where we want it to be, Lewin's language is we would then freeze it for a period of time. We'd reinforce the behaviors that allowed us to be successful in this new space. But he said we also need to be looking for the next transition. So rather than change being a linear process that's almost circular, where you're in a current state, you realize you have to change, you make a transition, you move into a new space. Once you're there, you start to analyze the external environment and figure out where you need to move to. The challenge in this whole process is coming to grips with a force in nature called inertia. And human beings tend to be looking for a state where they're comfortable, where there's a set of expectations that occur on a very regular basis. In large organizations, we call it a bureaucracy. That tends to lead to limited action. It tends to lead to very little activity to drive change. And that is a force that as a manager and a leader, we need to understand that that's lurking in the background at all times and is something that we need to deal with it. So as a manager, when you take a look at why it is that your change initiatives failed. You have a flash of brilliance. This is an absolutely stone good idea, yet you can't get it moving. So here's a checklist on why you can't get the momentum going. One is you have to get senior management on board, and they have to be aligned. You have to manage your relationship with all of your stakeholders. So take a look at who's going to be impacted by the change that's occurring and bring them on board. You have to be prepared to deal with resistance and distrust. That you have to have a plan for the execution of the change. Understand your plan is not going to be in concrete, but you have to have a direction in which you're going. You need to create a system of accountability and follow-through. And this one area is where I see a number of organizations fail, that they're unwilling to hold people accountable for their actions. And then we have to create a set of metrics that measure the direction that we're going. John Carter out of Harvard is somebody that you're going to see again and again and again as you go through your management development process. And he is sort of the guru of leadership change. And he lays out a set of actions that need to be taken. And he starts with developing a sense of urgency. Having had the challenge in the past of driving change in organizations, that was one of my biggest problems. I could see the need for change. My senior executive team could see the need for change, but we just couldn't drive that sense of urgency deep into the organization. You need to build coalitions. You can't do it alone. You have to have a clear and explainable vision of the future. And then you have to communicate it to the extent that if you say it one more time, you think you're going to throw up. You have to empower others, so you drive change and change decision-making down to the lowest level of competence. You need to be somewhat Machiavellian in setting up short-term wins so that people get in the habit of winning as they go forward. You have to be relentless in driving change. You simply never give up. That is not part of the equation because you know if you don't change, your organization is going to be in peril. And then you need to reinforce change by rewarding the behaviors of those that are driving change for you, and make sure that your behaviors and your executive team's behaviors are also consistent with the new state. So how is it that people typically react when you confront them with change? Carol Bennett shared with me this impact on personal change, and I thought it was very, very, very worthwhile. You can take a look at it and see how people go through a normal set of responses as change occurs. And you can see that almost any change that you introduce is going to result in a decrease in your employee satisfaction scores and a decrease in the efficiency of your organization. Let me say that again. Change is going to develop a state where you're not going to be performing as well as you did before, and the morale in your organization is probably going to be lower than it was before. Your job is to try to help them overcome that. One of the common mistakes that I see executives make is as they go through this curve where they're getting down into the valley, they haven't negotiated a long enough timeline with their executives or the boards of directors or whoever they report to for them to do the necessary things to make it happen. So if you're driving change, negotiate as long a period of time as you possibly can before they're going to pull the plug on it. Back when I was managing, we had 18 months to drive a change is what we would typically try to negotiate with the board or with our executives. I'm told today that realistically 6 months is about the longest period of time you're going to have as a manager or leader to effectuate change. So how do you do this? You've got to start out with making a good business case. You've got to sell it to your stakeholders. Again, you have to have your vision. You communicate it. You empower. And what's critical is that you celebrate each change that was successfully implemented. And we're going to talk about that again when we talk about teams. You have to celebrate your victories, or people are not going to have the emotional energy to drive change in the future. So what about you? How are you going to handle change? I love this quote. Change is not a four-letter word, but often the reaction you're going to have when change is introduced to you is in fact a four-letter word. So you're going to have to figure out how you're going to learn to feel uncomfortable, to feel incompetent. You're going to be under pressure to constantly provide better answers. You're going to have tension around loyalty. You're going to have pressure to get things done quickly. And in general, as the slide says, you need to be comfortable in a space where you normally don't operate. So I'm looking over the edge at change. One of my favorite authors is Charles Handy. And he introduced the concept of change as a series of S-curves or sigmoid curves. And he said, brilliant organizations, when you look at these curves, start to drive change as they're reaching the apex of the curve. Now, this is absolutely counterintuitive, that you would think when your organization is performing well, don't mess with it. You got a good thing going, don't break it. He's saying that a very effective manager and leader is going to start to drive change at the peak. Just a short story that exemplifies this. I was working with Sutter Health at a time where Pat Fry was the CEO. And he took a look into the future to see what was coming. And he decided that Sutter needed to go through a massive reorganization in order to be responsive to the changes that were taking place in healthcare. And he broke the organization apart and started to rebuild it in a year where the organization had its highest quality scores on patient care, its highest patient satisfactory scores, and was its most profitable in its history. They're not for profit, but their income statement was the strongest. So think of the courage that it takes for you as a manager and a leader to tackle change in your organization when you're at the top of those curves. Hopefully we've disturbed you enough that you're starting to get the idea that this management and leadership stuff is hard, and that is the space you're choosing to operate in, and you're going to be comfortable there. See you in the next video.